Good afternoon, everyone. I am Agnes He, Director of the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication at Stony Brook University. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to the Center's workshop series on language and social justice. One of the Center's core missions is to inform the public of the means and meanings of respecting and retaining multilingualism. And this workshop series results from dedicated efforts by the MIT-affiliated faculty members in response to the recent social justice movements nationwide. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the support and collaboration by the Center for Changing Systems of Power, the Institute of Globalization Studies, and the School of Professional Development. I would also like to thank Professor Sam Sharma, who will be co-hosting with me, and to Ms. Chikako Nakamura for coordinating this workshop series. Before we introduce our workshop facilitators today, I would like to share with you a recorded welcome message from Dr. Nicole Sampson, the Dean of College of Arts and Sciences.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicole Sampson, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Stony Brook University and Distinguished Professor of Chemistry. It's my honor to welcome you to the first workshop in the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication series on language and social justice. This series aims to promote social justice by addressing implicit and explicit bias against non-standard varieties of English, English as a second language, and non-English minority languages. The Center is dedicated to being responsive to societal needs and to creating societal impact through public lectures and workshops like this one. And the Center is creating much needed synergy among faculty to collaborate on research concerning languages, cultures, identities, and communities in a drastically changing world where communication is increasingly multilingual, multimodal, and intercultural. We at Stony Brook are fortunate to have entities such as the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication that exhibit our dedication to research and education and how to take constructive actions to lead change in our society on and off campus. This series aligns with the college's commitment to social justice, particularly linguistic justice, recognizing and respecting the linguistic and cultural backgrounds of all students, faculty, staff, and members of our community. Last, I would like to thank Agnes He, Chikako Nakamura, and Sam Sharma, and everyone else who worked to develop and plan this important workshop series. My best wishes for success in your research endeavors, and I look forward to seeing the benefits you will bring to our community. Take care and be well.
Thank you, Dean Sampson. Our workshop facilitators today are Dr. Joy Janzen and Dr. Francisco Ordóñez. Dr. Janzen is a lecturer in the linguistics department where she teaches classes on social linguistics and literacy. She has been a Fulbright scholar in Mexico and the Czech Republic, as well as a teacher and teacher educator in China, Romania, Russia, and the Navajo Reservation. Dr. Ordóñez is associate professor in the linguistics department. His specialization has been the comparative study of the syntax of Spanish, its varieties, and other Romance languages. His present research involves the study of the syntactic differences of the dialects of Spanish spoken in Latin America and in Spain. And before I give the floor to our facilitators today, a few housekeeping rules from my co-host, Dr. Sharma.
Thank you, Agnes. Just two tips. One is that the audio is muted for all of us just to minimize the background noise. But later on, when we are having open discussions, it'll be on. If you could keep your videos on whenever possible, it would allow the presenters to see a few faces as they talk. That's effective. Turning it off as needed. We'll be having breakout rooms. So if you have joined the session through a web browser, it may not permit you to go into breakout rooms. So I recommend using the app. Also, if there's a technical problem, we'll keep you in the main room. So No worries. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Agnes and Sam, and welcome to this inaugural workshop. Our topic today is language and ideology. And to introduce this topic and to explain a little bit about what we mean by these terms, we're going to talk about ourselves and who we are linguistically and how those profiles position us in American society. So as you're listening to me, most likely you're not giving any thought to my language at all. It may sound neutral to you perhaps, or unaccented. Maybe the term that comes to mind is standard English. I have an immense privilege associated with the language variety that I'm speaking, and that is that I grew up speaking it. And moreover, I grew up speaking only it. Now you may think, well, is that really an advantage to be a monolingual English speaker? It certainly was when it came to my transition to school, which was seamless. I never had to wonder who I was linguistically. I never had to wonder what people were thinking of the language that I spoke. This part of my identity was an unearned privilege that benefited me starting in nursery school, all the way up to high school. Sorry, all the way up to graduate school, I would say. Though I shed my monolingual status at some point along that journey. I have another privilege associated with the language that I'm speaking, and that is that for many Americans, I look like my language. I'll just say that again, I look like my language. So at a conservative estimate, I would say 100% of Americans would look at me and say white. And what this means for me is that when I'm traveling in the US and somebody asks me, so where are you from? And I say, New York. And they say, wow, of course. What they most likely do not go on to say is, but where were you born? Or where are your parents from, or your grandparents, or your people? No. For most Americans, I'm a standard American speaking standard American English. So my co-leader here has a very different linguistic profile, so I'm going to turn it over to him.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So, by contrast, I'm a second language learner of English. So I expect a lot of people to ask me where I'm from. And I am a bilingual speaker, Spanish and Catalan from Barcelona. I grew up in an environment in which using two languages is the most normal situation. And I still think it's the most normal situation for most people in this planet. I define myself also as a bilingual speaker, English, Spanish, here in the US. And I use the Spanish whenever I perceive I can use it. Since I am a speaker of Spanish, which is the second most spoken language in the US, the reactions I have received from people have been very different. I notice that people sometimes feel uncomfortable when they hear or they are surrounded by others who speak a language they cannot understand. On the other hand, the fact that I speak English with an accent, particularly in my instruction, has been something I have confronted in my teaching, since some of the students expect that in order to teach, let's say, linguistics, I should speak English as a native speaker with no quote unquote mistakes or accent. That could build into the perception on how good my instruction is perceived by some of the students. There is an ideology about the expectations of the language of the instructor, despite the fact that I take my English is, on the other hand, quite understandable. And I go leave it to Joy.
Okay, so thanks. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully this is actually going to work. And we're going to talk a little bit about the organization of the workshop and what we are hoping you will talk about and how. So this is the subject, language, ideology, and teaching. And this is who we are linguistically, different people. And this is the organization of the workshop. So we're going to ask you to engage in 3 different discussion activities that will last about 10 minutes each. These will be hopefully quite small groups, about 4 or 5 people. During that time when you are discussing, please choose someone to be a spokesperson, because once we have discussed these different points, we will ask the group to share, or some of the participants to share. We won't have time for every group to report back. The directions to what we're asking you to do and the questions that we are asking you are in the shared Google Doc. And the link to that Google Doc should be in the chat. If you have trouble accessing, just type a note in the chat and we will absolutely help you. So if you wish, write responses to all of the discussion activities in the Google Doc under the appropriate question. But where we would most like your responses is in the final task, when we are gathering up our ideas and thinking about the way forward. Okay, so we've been throwing around this term, ideology, without actually defining it. I think for most people, ideology has very negative connotations, the ideology of terrorists, of, I don't know, Chairman Mao. But here we are talking about ideology, or thinking about it simply as a system of beliefs that affects the way we view the world, or what we consider to be acceptable or appropriate behavior, and what we see as common sense. And I hope you'll remember that last point all the way through our discussion today, because we often accept ideologies about language that position people in very negative ways as simply common sense. So the first, we're going to be discussing a number of different aspects of language ideology and what many Americans consider to be acceptable, appropriate, and correct language behavior. And here are the first ones. The idea that a nation is unified by having a single language. I will just add here, for those of you who don't know, the United States does not have an official language at the national level. Approximately 2/3 of individual states have official English laws, but on a national level, we don't have one. English-only education is seen by many as the most effective approach for ensuring that all students will succeed in a society where English is dominant. And indeed, that particular aspect, that particular belief is very evident in American education, and that is what one of the main topics we're going to discuss today. So we're going to show you 2 short clips, and I'm hoping that they will be that you will find it easy to connect these clips to these pieces of ideology. All right, so this first one, a New Jersey high school.
Military men and women fighting are not fighting for your right to speak Spanish, they're fighting for your right to speak American. Military men and women fighting are not fighting for your right to speak Spanish, they're fighting for your right to speak American. Leave, be disrespectful, leave, disrespectful.
Okay, that's the first one. Oops, sorry. And here's the second one. This is...
Buenas noches y bienvenidos al concierto de Guinness. English only, USA. English only, USA. English only, English only, USA. English only, English only, USA. English only, USA.
I think that's enough of that particular one. All right, so these are the questions that we are asking you to discuss in the breakout room. I don't think the slide is visible once you get to the breakout room, but these questions are also in the shared Google Doc. We're going to ask you to discuss for 10 minutes and then to come back, and we will be delighted to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. I saw there was a very interesting discussion in the breakout rooms I went to. So we can not report everyone, but we can only have to choose 3 groups. They can report about 1 minute each. So who wants to volunteer the speak person of that group?
You can look at the time in my and behind me if you would like to try. You
just have to raise your hand. Yes.
I saw Lori raise her hand, so why don't we call on her?
Okay, sorry, I couldn't find the little hand icon, so I went with the real thing. So I was in a group with 2 other people, and we obviously disagreed with the first point and the second point about whether a nation should have a single language, and we discussed issues like how international students who are bilingual do very well in our society. So there's no evidence that you need to have an English only education to do well. We mentioned that native speakers of English who don't do a lot of reading or have a certain kinds of education maybe, don't do so well. So there's a lot of counter evidence to that. We pointed out the benefits of collaboration with other nations. Even if you're not fluent in other languages, there are some benefits for, international collaborations if you're familiar with other people's languages, and even if you're familiar with non-native English accents, it helps you with collaboration. And I think my minute is up.
Okay, thank you, Lori. Sarah, you have your hand up.
Sure. I was in a group with Leslie, Shaughnessy, Brian, and Agnes, and we had a very interesting discussion. We talked about how it could be helpful to share language, but not necessary. We also pointed out that having one language does not necessarily guarantee unity in a country. That's a very interesting point. And we didn't actually come to a conclusion about whether we agreed or disagreed with either of the statements. We just had a very wide-ranging discussion about both of those statements and about how it is helpful to be open-minded and how difficult it is sometimes to convince others to be open-minded about the issue of language. That's it.
Thank you. Naomi Scott.
Yes, hi. So in my group, we had discussed that that having more than one language is beneficial, that there's no reason why there can't be, unity and commonalities throughout a country without having having more than one language. As we discussed, that we sometimes see that in other countries where they might have an official language, but they definitely utilize, other languages as well. Then moving on to the education piece, we were pretty much in agreement that that education that the research seems to indicate that education being carried out bilingually definitely has more benefits than not. Especially for students, like for their first language, it helps to, when they're learning their second language, it helps to be able to support like really both languages. So we found that oftentimes like it's due to prejudice more than anything else when there is like when administrators or whoever is in charge doesn't want to have programs that are established in both languages.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And we have one more hand, Beck Spitzer. Peggy.
Okay.
You're muted.
Yes, there, I got it. Thank you. So we had very interesting people in our group because we had somebody who was a scholar of Muslim and wide-ranging languages, as she was raised in England, and she pointed out to us that that enforcing one language is sort of leads to a rise in nationalism, that this is not a 20th century construct that we need to work with. We also had another person in the group who was in Peru. So speaking from Peru, saying that she found that when Spanish was only instituted as the only language to use, that it really alienated a large portion of the population that spoke Quechua, I believe. And so this idea of what you do, answering the question, if you disagree, what do you see as an alternative? And I think that we decided that bilingual education and the right to choose a bilingual education was important.
Thank you. Thank you. I see that there has been a lot of consensus in a lot of groups with respect to the issues raised in the first video about the need for the beneficial aspects of bilingualism, and that there is not a this similarity. The idea of having a nation and a language is not a valid. It's a myth. It's an ideology more than a myth. Sorry. So let's move to the second activity then. So John Jays. So it was difficult to choose videos that in the first activity, which would introduce this particular point about the ideology of one nation, one language. It was difficult not because there are so few examples, but the opposite, because there were so many examples. There are, however, multiple ways of thinking about alternatives to the one nation, one language ideology that we have seen. Before we cycle back to that question, it's important to look at the perspective of multilingual, multi-dialect speakers. So as I mentioned, I'm a bilingual speaker, but in the United States, it's not only that we have more than one language, but people can be multi-dialectal as well. Appalachian English and Standard English, African-American English and Standard English. So we have these possibilities. So another piece of language ideology that often crops up when it comes to multi-speakers is that they are speaking broken forms of the language, or they don't know proper English, or don't speak the standard language, Spanish, English, whatever language you have in the country. We're going to look next at a video of a multilingual speaker who is using all of her linguistic resources. So, and she's not limiting herself to one language. And after you look at this video, we'll ask you again to discuss a couple of questions in breakout rooms. So the activity as you watch this is the speaker, and here's the video.
Buenos días, mis amores. So today, toda la mañana me la pasé editando. Ya it's uploading, pero I had to stop it because vamos a ir a comer a una casa de un primo de mis papás. Y and I just quickly showered because I was like in mis pijamas y todo. But yeah, this is like my makeup that I did. Just mascara, foundation, a little bit of bronzer, a little tiny bit of blush. Y luego me puse mi lápiz, no me gustó y me lo quité y así se me quedó. So that's because they're chapped, so I don't like lipstick como my hair's up in a bun and it's wet and I didn't want to do that to it because
No, thank you. So after, this is a very fascinating video for me, a Spanish speaker. So we're going to ask you you've seen the speaker doing what we're going to call translanguaging in Spanish and English. So we are asking you to discuss the following points. Number one is, what are your views about the speakers who mix languages? Do they do it because they don't know the words, and they have to move from one language to another? Do you agree with that or disagree with that, with the idea that they are they have to change because they don't find the words? The second question is, mixing produces broken or incorrect varieties of languages such as Spanglish, Chinglish, or Konglish. Namely, what validity do these mixed varieties have for you and in the context of the school and education, okay? They are not considered standards. So, and I'm bringing here the question standard. And question 3, if you speak multiple languages and or dialects, do you mix them? Think about yourself. If you don't, what do you think when you hear other people mixing languages or dialect? What is your reaction when you hear around you people mixing languages? I'm a linguist and I always like people hearing people mixing language, but I understand other people might have other reactions. And number 4, does your opinion change if this mixing occurs in the, so given that we know that people mix languages, what do you think about what do you think about it in the setting of education in your classroom when you hear children mixing more than one language? What is your reaction? What is your opinion? Okay, so I'm sending everybody to breakout rooms to discuss these questions, and so we're gonna do what we did before, which is volunteers to discuss, to talk to the whole group about what the questions that we proposed there. Any volunteers? I was in a group with Rose there. I think that she had a very interesting experience. So Rose, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So the first, in the first statement, speakers who mix languages do so because they don't know words. Most of us didn't agree because in other languages, sometimes you can't translate everything to English. So it's like you say the word like, I don't know, cajon, and then you explain it in English so the other person can not only understand what it means, but also hear the word, right? There's no translation. So it's not really about people not knowing the words, there's just not a specific a way to translate that. And in the next one, mixing produces broken or incorrect varieties. In some cases, people do feel like that might be incorrect, depending how we grow up, I suppose, how you're taught. When I was learning in school in the States, I was told not to speak Spanish. So I told myself to never speak Spanish because they told me that that's how I would learn English. So I never spoke Spanish. I never used Spanglish. Now I don't feel as bad about it, thankfully. So I don't think it's always, I don't think it's incorrect. I think it's just depends on the situation, the context, and everything else. If you speak multiple languages, do you mix them? I think a lot of people mix them, but also it depends on the situation. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rose. Elise, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, we our conversation went in many different directions, but a sort of key theme, I think, was this idea of control and access. So we spoke about how this first question about not knowing or phrases or something is maybe perceived as somebody having a lack of grasp or lack of control of English, but how in fact that can be representative of, as the last speaker Rose said, of a concept that isn't translatable or is able to express more in its original, in its linguistic origin. And so that kind of led us to a topic also in regard to the educational system and how one, there's sort of a fear or perceived lack of control of the educator as a sort of authoritative figure if students are speaking a language that the educator can't sort of surveil or understand. And also how there are, in fact, many untranslatable terms that are sanctioned in academia as being discipline specific. So I was speaking from my position in art history, where there are many French and German terms, for example, that we use to describe things in
just
art.
a reminder of the time. Yep. finish that.
Oh, just well, and how that is perceived in a very different light, right? Than to have a student who can come up with a translation for a term versus an instructor to teach a non-translatable term as the proper term.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great, Elise. Rashawn Davis.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, Rashawn. Yeah, just similar to the last two, we were saying something very similar in my group as well. Just that, you know, just because someone switches a language doesn't mean they don't know the word. Like, obviously, some concepts don't translate. Like I was saying, like how in Spanish, the word estrenar doesn't translate into English, but it's the concept of wearing or doing something for the very first time. But also, I was saying that it also depends on the person's comfortability with the two languages. And just which ones their brain recalls first, because sometimes they may know the word in both languages, but their brain chooses to use one language to recall that specific word or concept first, and that's the one that they go with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Very good. Excellent. We have more time, or I think
maybe we should move on.
Yeah. Well, to wrap up this section, what we've seen in the video and what we've been discussing, it's the term used for this mixing of languages is the term translanguaging. I heard that some of you already knew it. Translanguaging is defined as the act performed by bilinguals of accessing different linguistic features or various modes of what are described as autonomous language in order to maximize communicative potential. So there is a communicative interest in doing this. Translanguaging makes very clear how the change of language is a resource for speakers to communicate their fluidity in the society, as well as it makes evident that the boundaries between languages can be blurred in certain conditions. What matters in this case is individual, and it also puts into question this ideology that we were discussing before of a nation and a language, as we saw in the first video. Finally, it brings the issue of defining the next topic of the next video, which is how do we define standard English and whether there is an ideology behind it, and the idea of standard English as the language of education in the academic language. Okay, so I leave it to Joy. Hello?
Excuse me. All right. So just to underline again what Paco was saying about the naturalness of this linguistic behavior, that it can be in many contexts unnatural to snip off half of yourself or a third of yourself or a tenth of yourself, depending on your linguistic background, to present only that one particular variety of language. And the boundaries between languages, and this is a whole nother topic that we're not going to have time to talk about today, that Paco briefly touched on, those boundaries can be very arbitrary. What constitutes a named language and what is another named language? But before we move on to what kinds of perspectives that or what sort of stances we can take as teachers in the classroom to fully support our multilingual, multidialectal speakers, I thought we could talk just briefly about what is standard English. So I had actually put these questions in a poll, but I think that perhaps Chicago, why don't we open the poll? We'll open it for 1 minute. Just going to ask all of you to answer these questions. And do you see these as being standard English or not? I'm putting this in here partly because I love polls. So I don't know if I'm the only person in the Zoom call who likes polls, but let's try it. So don't think about it very much. Just give an answer. Okay. All right, yeah. So if you want to share the results too, or yeah, there we go. So take a look. I think this is interesting. And I don't know, is everyone able to scroll up and down in the poll? Or am I the only one who can do that?
Yes.
Okay. So what is particularly interesting about this is that we have no absolute findings, even for the first one, which is a sentence that many people, well, let's see, 82% of the group today would identify as not being standard. But my point really was that breakdown of no absolute agreement about what is the nature of standard English. We are not necessarily, it's not an entity that's easy to define. It can be very slippery and elusive. So to lead up to our next discussion question, I just want to suggest a couple of points about standard English. And that is that many people believe that there is somehow an unaccented form of speech that everyone can understand. And sorry, is this another? I'm seeing another poll. So no, okay. Many people believe that there's an unaccented form of speech that everyone can understand, and that's the standard, and that other varieties are slang or incorrect. Of course, there is no unaccented form of a language. Everyone has an accent. It depends on where you're standing, who counts as having an accent and who doesn't. But the important point about this also is that it can become common sense to internalize. We can internalize this belief about what is the standard and what is correct. And that sometimes it's acceptable to have prejudice against a variety of language in a way that it is not, in most circles, I would like to believe, acceptable to have prejudice or to openly express prejudice against a group of people. So we can say that Spanglish is slang when we would not articulate derogatory comments about speakers of Spanglish. And because of this language ideology, members of those minoritized groups can internalize the beliefs that the standard is at the top and the varieties that they speak are at the bottom. And this is clearly less than ideal in an educational setting for many reasons, but is very prevalent in ideology that dominates American education and underpins American education. So just to review briefly the particular elements of language ideology that we've been talking about, that a nation is unified by a single one, and that the best way to acquire the socially dominant language of the United States is to learn only in English and to use English only in the classroom. Also that speakers need to speak one language at a time. And the correlation of this is that the burden for understanding falls not on the monolingual English speaker, but on the multilingual, multidialectical speaker to cross the bridge and make it easy for that English speaker to understand. So this is something that Paco touched on briefly in his introduction. Many Americans can feel, if they are monolingual English speakers, that it is their right to be able to understand everything that's being spoken in their environment. And if it's not understandable to them, they can feel that the behavior of those speakers is inappropriate or incorrect. And again, the only form of language acceptable in education is standard English. So we can agree, and I think based on the conversations that I was able to hear, we all agree that this is not ideal, that this is unfair, that this is wrong when it comes to how multilingual speakers are positioned in education. But at the same time, we can still feel the responsibility to promote or to teach or to require students to utilize standard English. And it's really that question that we're leaving you with, that we'd like you to discuss in this last breakout room. So we're going to give you 10 minutes for this. And if you are willing, also write some answers in the Google Doc. This is one place where I think it would be great to hear from everyone. Okay, so see you in a breakout room. So for those of you who are already here, if you want to talk, if you could just put up a hand or something. I would love to hear if there are people who haven't spoken before and would be willing to speak this time. It would be great. Is everybody back? I think so, right? Okay.
Paula?
I hear. I see Paula. Please say something.
Yes, well, I'm going to say that you can't see me because my camera is not working. So sorry about that. My group was very enthusiastic. We have Frank and Nancy and myself, and we were discussing the issue of standard English. And we ended up agreeing that standard English is a tool for everyone, for native speakers of English who may be speaking, and I'm using air quotes right now, non-standard varieties of English, and for international people who are living in the United States like myself, right? So we have we use on daily basis, we use different varieties of English, but we need to use standard English in more professional settings because we're being perceived differently if we are not using that. So looking for a job, for instance. So I think that is very important to keep in mind that there are many different varieties that are going to be more or less acceptable or adequate in certain situations. My time is up.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So Sam, can you see? I can't see who else is. Shaughnessy, did you have your hand up? Okay.
Yes. How do I get my hand down? My group spoke a little bit about the same topic, kind of the responsibilities toward the students who are looking for feedback on their English or how they're being perceived. So kind of the context of if you're in a classroom where the student is communicating what they need to communicate and, you know, it's not necessarily a subject that they need to be using like the standard perception of English, that kind of grammar, that's great. But if it is like an English class or, you know, they're using grammar that we know they'll be perceived negatively for, we kind of can explain to them the different registers of English that they might be hitting and, you know, being honest about like, this is the way that you're being perceived. If you use that in a job setting, you know, I get the point. That works for this classroom. It might not work for elsewhere. And just kind of explaining the nuances to them as well.
Thanks.
Okay, great. So Rashawn?
In my group, we kind of took a little bit of a different approach because we all agree that like when it comes to the word, using the word like standards is a little tricky because what is standard English, right? There's standard American English, there's standard British English, there's standard South African, Australian, New Zealand English. So when we say standard English, like, which one are we teaching? Because all of those can vary and they do vary. So for us, we kind of agreed that it's important to teach the basic structure of the English language in terms of grammar, but allowing the students or the speaker to choose which variety of English English they wish to speak. As long as they're able to communicate understandably and they have the basic grammar constructs down packed, then however they speak and whatever they choose to speak is up to them.
Yeah, okay, great. Did we have another person who would like, another group would like to raise a comment?
Don't see hands.
There was a comment in the chat.
Okay. Do you want to read it? Because
Yes, our group questioned the definition of this. It was by Hee-Jung Son, I think. Sorry to pronounce. Our group questioned the definition of the standard English that we are talking about here. What English is standard English that we all agree on? Was the question.
We didn't in the poll.
Yes, we really didn't. I was, as I said, I was somewhat surprised about that because often, and I'm sure this is the case with many of you in education, the definition of the standard, we may not agree on what it is, but we can often agree on what it is not. And generally, what is not part of standard English for most people is ain't or double negation. But we're not in agreement on that either. And that, of course, that lack of agreement makes choosing the standard as the target for everything really problematic. If we don't agree, how can we teach it? How can we require it? How can we make it the gatekeeping mechanism in education all the way through? Okay, so I was going to share some slides, but could I just ask again, were there comments that I haven't heard or other people who wanted to add something to the discussion?
This is Susan. I just wanted to say that my responses to the poll were a little challenged by the fact that I'm aware that certain parts of English are going out of style. And in my generation, they are standard English, but in my students' generation, they are not. So, you know, just as the subjunctive tense seems to have been fading away over some time, the difference between less and few, you know, fewer and less seems to be going away. It makes me crazy, but it is going away. And it's just something that we have to identify English as a living, breathing thing. And not be too prescriptive about it. And yet there is one that feels more eloquent to me. And it's a difficult thing to judge, I think.
Right. Of course, the point being that we do judge
Yes,
all the time, or maybe not us individually, but standardized.
I think it's important to put your biases on the table. And I tell my students that I'm biased toward liking this kind of language more because I am. So might as well be open about it.
Frank, had you wanted to say something?
Yeah, Paula spoke for our group, but I just wanted to say as an educator here at Stony Brook, in fact, I'd like to maybe be an ambassador to get us more involved with other programs that can help the students. There's spoken English and then there's written English. And when, you know, and I'm in the music department, I'm a musician, I teach music. When students are developing papers which they may use in going for job interviews, might be part of their portfolio, so to speak. I'm afraid not to have that be really good standard English because I don't want them perceived badly, not because I don't get what they're saying or that I'm happy with it on that level, just like performance. But if they go and do, we have, as musicians, when we do master classes, we have people from all over the world, right? Or I go to other countries and I'm speaking maybe none of that other language. And we have people, but in that regard, we don't judge in our part of the field. But I'm always concerned about papers. And then the other concern I had was acceptability of students to the school. Although Stony Brook has now, as I said to you, slightly reduced the need for foreign language speakers if they've coming from American institutions where they have a degree, where they have actually gotten a degree, that there is a slightly lowering of the TOEFL requirement, et cetera. So these are the problems I face in wanting to help my students. And I want to help them so much. You know,
yeah, so. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we have 5 minutes left. I am going to briefly share my screen and make a couple of concluding remarks. So these are a few of our answers about that question of how you balance the expectations of the wider society for producing and using only one variety of language with our understanding, hopefully every day increasing understanding of who we are linguistically and who our students are. I think it's also an ongoing question about making this issue of language central to the curriculum in every content area, not just in the writing curriculum. And investigating language and thinking about language and developing your awareness and your students' awareness of language expectations in the wider world. And finally, something that it sounds like many of you are doing already, ask the students, What are they doing and why? When do they want to use languages and why? And finally, I think that we can agree with this point that allowing students to use all of their linguistic resources will be great in a single classroom, but unless we can move that awareness into a wider world, it may not ultimately, well, it will certainly have positive impacts, but it may not have all the positive impacts that we want. So we were thinking we'd like to leave you with a perspective from cognitive psychology. And cognitive psychologists have done research into the nature of expertise. They've researched chess players and people who do medical diagnosis. They have also researched teachers. And one of their findings is that expert teachers can be differentiated from experienced non-experts, not by their knowledge. Both groups of teachers have deep knowledge about the content they teach and about pedagogical practices. But what differentiates expert teachers from everyone else is questions. Are they continually asking questions, asking newer and deeper questions, reframing the context in which they teach? So we have so much appreciated your insightful comments and all the points that you've raised today. We don't have the answers, clearly, but we do have those questions, and we have hopefully continually developing newer, deeper, more profound understanding of language ideology and who we are and who our students are in relation to that. And finally, one of the questions that we certainly hope you're going to be asking is, what am I going to do next week at this hour, 3:30, where we will have our next workshop that is going to focus on writing. So we very much hope that you will all be there. And if I may say one last thing,
So can I share the screen? Just, sorry, I'll do that. Keep talking.
So wait, give me one more moment. If I can just speak for myself about this, I would be delighted to be in touch with any and all of you about resources that you have, resources that I can share. So please email me. I'd be happy to hear from you. And I can put my email in the chat if you'd like me to do that. And finally, if I could just say thanks to Sam and thanks very much to Agnes, who is the moving spirit of all these workshops and the reason why we're all staring at ourselves in little squares and talking about such an important topic. So thank you.
Just wanted to show the slide flyer for the next workshop. Please join.
Okay, so feel free to hang on if you want to ask us something or chat with us. But if not, thank you again for coming and hope to see you next week.